Welcome to Game Theory Online. I'm Kevin Leyton-Brown. I'm one of the 3 instructors for this course. The other 2 are Matt Jackson and Yoav Shoham, both from Stanford University. You'll see them both in subsequent videos. This video is going to give you a high-level sense of what game theory is all about and the kinds of concepts that we're going to think about in the rest of the course. First of all, before I go on, let me tell you a little bit more about what game theory isn't. Game theory doesn't use the word game in the way that most of us are used to in common life, and it certainly doesn't think particularly about computer games. Instead, game theory is a way of thinking about strategic interactions between self-interested people. For this reason, it's very important for economics, and also for computer science, political science, psychology, and a variety of other disciplines. What ties all of these disciplines together is a concern for thinking about how self-interested participants would behave in strategic interactions, and also thinking about how those interactions should be structured, for example, by a government or by the designer of a computer system, in order to lead to good outcomes. I'm going to begin by thinking about one such example from computer science. This is an example that involves networking, but don't be scared off by the computer science content. It isn't representative of what will come in the rest of the course, and in any case, I'm not going to assume that you have any particular knowledge about how computers work in this example. I'm going to begin by thinking about this pop-up, which you might have seen in your browser before. And if you're like most people, you realize that a pop-up in your browser that promises slow connection detected, click next to correct, maybe shouldn't be trusted. It might install a virus or otherwise harm your computer, so you probably wouldn't click on this. But the interesting thing is, if you did, this particular pop-up might actually help you. I'd like to think about how it works, and we can use this example to illustrate something interesting about game theory. Before I do that, I need to tell you a little bit about how the TCP protocol works, which is one of the backbones of the internet. So, as you probably know, if you're over here on the internet and you want to communicate with some other computer, which is over here, what happens is that your communication gets broken up into a bunch of different packets, which conceptually are kind of like envelopes with a message inside them that get delivered across the network to your recipient. And when I say delivered across the internet, I mean you don't actually have a direct connection between your computer and your desired recipient. Instead, there's a whole sequence of different computers along the way who pass the message one to the next to get it from you to your recipient. So you pass the message along the network to some computer you're connected to. It passes it to another computer, and so on down the chain until it reaches your recipient. At that point, your recipient sees that the message is addressed to it, and it sends back an acknowledgement to you telling you that it received the message. And that acknowledgement, likewise, passes through a whole sequence of computers until it gets back to you. So far, so good. Here's the catch. Sometimes a computer in the internet is overwhelmed with messages. Let's say this one right here. And when that happens, it handles this congestion in a pretty surprising way. It takes some of the messages that it receives, and it just throws them away. And it doesn't tell anyone. It just deletes the messages until it gets down to a level that it can handle again. And then with the stuff that it can handle again, it continues behaving as it should, passing messages on appropriately. Well, you might wonder, then, how it is that you end up with reliable communication over the internet, given that every now and then some computer on the internet throws away your messages. Well, the way that this works is that your computer waits a certain amount of time after sending a message to see if it gets an acknowledgement. And if it doesn't, it assumes that the message was never received and sends it again. Here's the part that's important for our discussion of game theory. Your computer also does something else in this situation. It slows down the speed at which it continues to send messages in the future on the assumption that there's some congestion somewhere in the network, and that this congestion can be reduced by bombarding the network with fewer messages per unit time. And likewise, other computers on the internet are doing the same thing, That's why we don't have the network completely saturated. That's why most of the time we get pretty reasonable throughput on the internet, because everybody is balancing the speed that they send messages out using what's called this backoff mechanism in the TCP protocol. OK, that's all you need to know about the backoff mechanism. I'd like to think about the strategic problem that you face in deciding whether to install this somewhat suspicious-looking piece of software. That is, I'd like to ask, should you send your packets on your network connection using a correctly implemented version of the TCP protocol, which does have the backoff mechanism inside it? Or should you run this program and instead use a defective implementation which disables the backoff mechanism and just blasts the network all the time without any concern for the congestion that it will cause other people or you? Well, this is a bit of a surprising use of language, but problems like this one are what game theorists call games. A game in general is any interaction between two or more people where the outcomes of the interaction depend on what everybody does, and everybody has different levels of happiness for the different outcomes. So let's think about a two-player version of this interaction, which a game theorist would call a two-player game. You might incidentally worry that the internet has a lot more than two people using it, and so that this two-player restriction is going to be a problem. You'll have to trust me, but this example scales very naturally to larger numbers of players, and everything interesting about it would remain true. So in the two-player case, we have a question of whether each of the players should use a correct implementation, whether one of them will use a correct implementation and the other one a defective implementation, or whether both of them will use defective implementations. In the case, so we need to say what happens in order to analyze this. Let's say that when both players use correct implementations, they both experience a delay of 1 millisecond. Let's say that if one person uses a correct implementation and the other person uses a defective one, then the person with the defective implementation manages to flood the network with packets in a way that causes the other person to back off pretty heavily, causing the person who backed off to experience a much longer delay, and the person with the defective implementation to get their packets through virtually immediately. Lastly, let's say that if both people use defective implementations of TCP, then we're again in a symmetric situation where they both experience the same delay, and they both experience a bigger delay than they would have before, because there's now a greater chance that their packets will be lost at every stage in the chain, and so it will take them longer to send a message. Well, I'd like to encourage you to play this game with a friend, or to play it even just in your head, or best of all, to play it on the online system that we've provided, where you can interact with other students in the class. What do I mean to play a game? Well, this game might not seem very exciting to play as compared to other things that you would call games like soccer or chess. But in principle, all of these games are the same. There are sets of actions that players can take, and after everybody has chosen what they're going to do in the game, there's some result where everybody feels at different levels of happiness. This very simple game has each player choose either to use a correct implementation or to use a defective implementation. And once we know what both players will do, we can look at these rules that I've given here and decide how happy both players would be. Of course, nobody likes delay, so the players are trying to minimize the amount of delay that they experience in the network. So if you wanted to minimize the amount of delay that you experienced, how would you play this game? That's kind of the most natural question to think about when you're thinking about a game theoretic setting. But I'd like to invite you to think about a bunch of other more abstract and philosophical questions, which we'll also address throughout this course. First of all, do you think it's the case that all users should be expected to behave the same in a situation like this? Relatedly, if you're not one of the players of the game, but rather you're someone who cares about how the whole system works from the outside, for example, the designer of the network, what kinds of global patterns of behavior would you expect to see emerge? You'll notice that these numbers that I came up with here are a little bit arbitrary, and they're not very precise. It's reasonable to wonder how much these predictions that we can make about how the game should be played and what behavior would occur depend on those numbers. Is it the case that for slightly different numbers, we would expect to see very different behavior? What effect would there be if players could communicate with each other before they played the game in a non-binding way? What effect would there be if players could repeatedly play the game against each other, either for a finite number of repetitions or infinitely? Finally, how important is it how I model my opponent? Is it different if I think my opponent is rational and does something that is in his or her own best interest? Or would I play this game in the same way regardless of how I believe my opponent is thinking about the game? These are examples of the kinds of questions that this course will help you to think about and will offer you some answers to. And the TCP Backoff game is just one example of a real-world situation that we can examine using game theory. Throughout the course, we'll describe many more real-world examples that game theory can be used to think about. Thank you for joining us in this course. We hope you have a great experience, and we look forward to seeing you in coming up videos. Bye-bye.
We will be talking about self-interested agents and their interactions. So let's first speak about what we mean by self-interested agents. We don't mean necessarily that agents are adversarial or don't care about what happens to other agents. What we mean by that is that agents have opinions, have preferences. And so there's some description of the world, how the world could be, and in different descriptions, the agents have different preferences and different utilities, as we'll say. And so what we mean by a utility function is a mathematical measure that tells you how much the agent likes or does not like a given situation. It describes not only their attitude towards a definitive event. So for example, tomorrow the temperature will be exactly 25 degrees centigrade, but in fact it'll describe the preferences towards a distribution of such outcomes. So it really captures their attitude towards uncertainty about events. So for example, if I tell you that it will be 25 degrees with probability 0.7 and 24 degrees with probability 0.3, you might have an opinion about how much you like that versus some other distributions. And the decision theoretic approach, which is what underlies modern game theory, says that you're going to try to act in the way that maximizes your expected or average utility. And so this is a concept we need to get comfortable with, and it's not obvious that one would want to use such an approach. So for example, we are going to look at a single dimension, so your preferences will all be on a scale. As we'll see, the scale is not that important. Unlike probabilities, utilities don't have to lie in the 0-1 scale, but they will lie on a linear dimension, and maybe that's inappropriate. So for example, you might have some level of wealth and some degree of health, and for a certain level of each one, you'll have some notion of well-being. But is it appropriate to put the two together and have a single scale? You might question that. Similarly, why is looking at the expected value when you're looking at your uncertainty? Why looking at the expected value an appropriate way to capture your attitude? And so these are not trivial statements, and in fact not tautological. They make a substantive claim. But there's a very long tradition, and maybe the most famous reference is to Von Neumann and Morgenstern's seminal book which is really in some ways the introduction to modern day game theory, that derives these utility function from more basic assumptions one makes. And we won't go into that, but we just wanted to flag this issue as something that will underlie everything we say about game theory, and which really underlies modern game theory.
Hi folks, welcome back. So this is Matt Jackson, and we're talking now about defining games, and we'll work through some basic definitions of the key ingredients in games. So let's take a look at some of those. So obviously, one of the most obvious ones is the players in the game. So who's making the decisions? Are they people? Are we talking about governments negotiating over trade agreements? Are we talking about companies choosing their strategies for developing new products? Do we want to get down to the point of modeling people within a firm as opposed to the company as a whole? So there's a whole series of questions about how we're going to choose the players, but they're going to be the central decision makers in what we're doing. Next, we have to decide how we're going to model the actions. So what actions can players actually take? So when later on in the course we'll be looking at auctions, they'll have bids, so they can enter a number of bids. When we're talking about bargaining, they might be deciding whether or not to strike. When we're thinking about investing, it could be that an investor is deciding how much of a stock to buy or sell, when to buy or sell it, how they should react to other people in the market, how they should be conditioning their decisions on prices. When we're thinking about voters, how do they vote? So there's going to be a whole series of actions, and we'll want to be careful in making sure that we have the essential actions modeled. Finally, payoffs. So what's motivating the players? Do they care simply about some sort of profit? Do they care about other players? So how are they receiving utility as a function of what the actions lead to in the context of the game? So there's basically two standard representations of games. One is what's known as the normal form, and that's what we'll be starting with in the course. And what it does is it's a very simple and stark representation of a game. So it lists what payoffs players get as a function of their actions. Normally it's thought of as if players are moving simultaneously, but strategies, and we'll talk about this in more detail, can encode many things. So the other alternative representation is what's known as the extensive form, and that includes more explicit timing in the game. So who moves at what point in time. So that's going to be represented often as a tree. So for instance, in chess, one player moves first. The white player generally moves first, and the black player can see the move by the other player, react to that, and so forth. So that's going to be better represented as a tree than in normal form. So it keeps track of also what players know when they move. So if in poker, somebody moves first, they make a bet, but the other player only sees the bet and not necessarily the cards that the other player sees. So in some cases, we'll have sequential games where players will have different information at different points in time, and we'll want to talk about modeling that explicitly too. So we're going to start out with the normal form, and then we'll move later in the course to the extensive form, and we'll talk about the relationship between these two in more detail. Okay, so normal form games. What are the key ingredients? Again, players. So we're going to think of finite sets of players. So 1 through n, little n will represent the set of players. Generally, we'll index these things by an I. So we'll use a little I to represent a generic player. The action set for players will represent by a sub I. Okay, so we'll let that represent the actions of player I, and then we'll talk about profiles of actions, which will just be a list of what every player is doing. So, for instance, are they deciding to cooperate or not to cooperate with other players, for instance, in a prisoner's dilemma that we'll talk about. The utility function is then a payoff function, which indicates as a function of all the actions that are played, what's the payoff for the different players. So for each player I, we end up with a function which tells us how they evaluate outcomes of the game. And again, how they evaluate these things could encapsulate many things, and it's going to be very important to make sure that we're getting the right representation of what really motivates people. Okay, so often when we represent normal form games, a very simple way of doing that is just in a matrix representation. So let's just look at the most standard representation of very simple games. Writing a two-player game as a matrix. So we'll have player one will be the row player. Player two will be a column player, so they're going to choose actions that will be represented in the column of the matrix. And the cells, inside the cells, will then represent the payoffs. So for instance, the TCP Backoff game that was talked about in the earlier video can be written as a matrix as follows. So the row player, player one, can choose either C or D. So this is player one's choice, generally known as the row player. This is player two's, the column player. And they represent the choices that they have. And then inside the cells are the payoffs to the different players. So if player one cooperates and player two cooperates, then these are the payoffs to the two players. The first payoff, player one; second payoff, player two. So this is going to the column player. This one's going to the row player. Okay. Then we end up, for instance, if the row player chooses D and the column player chooses C, then we end up with a payoff here of 0 to the row player and -4 to the column player. So the matrix is a very simple way of representing all of the basic elements of the normal form game visually, so that we can actually keep track of exactly what the strategic interaction is and what players would like to do as a function of the game. Okay. Let's talk about another game that we won't be able to write down in such a simple form. So let's think of a large collective action game. So for instance, whether or not a population wants to revolt against this government. So here we have many more players. So let's imagine that we have a population of 10 million players. So we're obviously not going to be able to write that down as a matrix on our screen. So we can do that more abstractly. But we'll have 10 million players. What are their actions here? Let's keep it very simple. So they have a choice here of either revolting or not. So their action set is just binary, 2 choices. Then the payoffs are going to be the critical thing in this game. What happens? Well, let's say that in order for a revolt to be successful, you need at least 2 million people to participate. So in this particular stylized example, what do we end up with then? We can represent a successful revolt as the player getting a payoff of 1. So UI of the action profile A is equal to 1 if the number of people here, the number of players J, such that they picked to revolt, the number of this is at least 2 million. So if we end up with at least 2 million people revolting, then player I gets 1. And note here that this is true regardless of whether I is one of the revolt participants. So this is a game where you care about the end outcome, not necessarily getting utility out of the participation. We could change this and have people get enjoyment out of the participation or have costs of the participation directly as well. Okay, so what happens if things fail? Here, if we end up with less than 2 million, then it depends on whether you were a participant in the revolt or not. So if player I was a participant in the revolt and it fails, then they get a payoff of -1. So this could be in a situation where they're punished by the government or face some other kinds of sanctions, and they get a payoff of 0 if the revolt's not successful and they didn't participate, so they weren't one of the people that was actually revolting. Now, obviously, this is very stylized, but what it does capture is that players have to strategically analyze and predict what other players are going to do, and their payoffs depend not only on what they're doing, right? So here we have a situation where player I's payoff depends on whether they revolt or not, but it also depends on what other players are doing, and it can depend in fairly complicated ways on what all the players in the game are doing. Okay, so just in summary, in defining games, we have two different forms, the normal form and an extensive form. For now, we're starting with the normal form, critical ingredients, players, actions, and payoffs. Later, when we get to the extensive form, that's going to bring in timing, information, and so forth. So extra things that will account for more detailed representations of the strategic interaction by players.